General, the president gave his case for the strikes this morning, but he had a warning for the public. Let's watch this together.
My administration has taken every possible step to minimize the risk to U.S. personnel in the region. Even so, and I do not make this statement lightly, the Iranian regime seeks to kill. The lives of courageous American heroes may be lost, and we may have casualties. That often happens in war. But we're doing this not for now. We're doing this for the future, and it is a noble mission.
Your interpretation, sir, of that statement, particularly the part where he says we're doing this not for now, but for the future. Is he trying to be realistic about the risks? Do Americans need to be reminded of the risks of war?
They damn well better, Alex. And that's the point that I continuously try and make whenever I'm talking about this. Whenever you put America's sons and daughters in harm's way, you better be understanding of the potential risk for death and injury. But in this case, what we're talking about is a whole lot of overflying weapon systems, Air Force weapon systems, missiles, navies in the Gulf, the Arab Gulf, and also the Mediterranean Sea that are within range of strikes. There are some, and as well as some of the bases in the various Arab countries around the region of Iran. Those are all certainly threatened by any kind of action that Iran might take to counter these kind of missiles. And you have to consider the potential for death or injuries of American forces. And him saying that as kind of an afterthought of, hey, by the way, we've got to be concerned with casualties. And that's the way I read it. It is, in my view, problematic. That's why you go to Congress first to debate whether or not you're going to employ U.S. forces. Right. For Congress represents the American people, and the American people should have a say in whether or not their sons and daughters are put in harm's way.
General, before I get to my colleagues here in the studio, one more question regarding what we heard, and this is attributable to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who says that there are, quote, many signs that Iran's supreme leader has been killed. He did not definitively say that he is dead. MS now has not been able to confirm that. And we should say that the ministry spokesperson for the foreign ministry in Iran said that both the president and supreme leader are safe and sound. So they are refuting that report. But if it is true, in your mind, how plausible is that to have happened?
It's plausible, Alex, but what I'd say, too, is there's been open source intelligence over the last several weeks that says Iran has been preparing for these strikes, that the supreme leader has delegated some responsibilities for people who can carry on the regime after him. That the IRGC has done the same thing. So they understand the implications of these kind of strikes, and they know that they will have casualties in their own regime. So they have prepared for it. But even so, there's a danger if it did happen. And that is, the president's comment that he was interested in regime change. That's interesting, but populations of 90 million people that are very diverse, like the ones you find in Iran, just don't suddenly rise up and establish a new leadership and a new regime with the size of the security force that Iran has, which some estimate as over 500,000 people under arms. So even if all of that did happen and Iran finds himself without a leader, there is still danger of complete chaos inside of that country. Because again, regime change is very ugly. I've experienced it a couple of times in Iraq, and it is not easy to execute a regime change and have a new leadership step forward.
Eamon, your reaction to what the general has just said there, in addition to the prospect of the Ayatollah having been killed in this strike?
Well, he brings up a very important point, which we do know, actually, that the Iranian regime has put together a succession plan for the succession of the regime, if you will. And it was really based on the fact that the way the Iranian regime was set up was to diffuse power across several boards or across different centers of power. You had the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, you had the military, you had the Basij, you also had the judiciary, and then you had the clerics, and you had the Guardian Council and the Council of Experts, and all of these different factions within the regime had a certain amount of power. And we know at one point that Ali Larijani was the person who was tasked with making sure that the regime after Khamenei, if he is confirmed to have been killed, would continue on with some kind of succession plan. Now, it is very possible that in the midst of this succession plan, other figures have been killed in this initial strike. But they were, as the general was saying, were very much anticipating a possible strike against the regime. And the biggest evidence of that is twofold. One, what we saw last year when Israel carried out a successful attack, killing 40 of the most senior members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, head of intelligence and what have you. The regime was able to replenish itself after absorbing that initial shock within 48 hours and then launched the counteroffensive against Israel. And one more point that is very important is that over the course of the last 50 days or so, the Iranian regime that was able to suppress this uprising that took place where, by some accounts, 30,000 Iranians were killed, that happened with local Iranian forces. It wasn't like Syria, where the regime used air force or dropped barrel bombs and big clusters on population centers. These were local Iranian police forces and Basij and what have you, the security forces, killing protesters with small arms. Those forces are still very much on the ground in various parts of the country of about 90 million people. And so unless you have a plan to say to the command and control of every rank and file unit, the regime is done, hand over your weapons, you are in a very dangerous situation. Because on one hand, if you do that very quickly, you collapse the entire state. And as the general knows, that is what happened in Iraq, was we collapsed the regime of Saddam Hussein. The next day, the Iraqi military was basically disbanded. The civil service was disbanded. And you had overnight 2 million, 3 million Iraqis that were angry at the Americans, lost their livelihoods, and now facing an American occupation. We're not in that situation right now with air power. And quite honestly, historically, air power has never been enough to cause a regime change. It didn't work against Slobodan Milosevic when the U.S. Went to that aerial campaign, and it hasn't worked in other parts of the world. So at some point, you have to ask, what does the replacement plan look like? And I haven't heard from any Arab leader, by the way, who have been in touch with the U.S. administration about what that looks like. And that's what I wanted to conclude with, was the sources I've been speaking to in the region say, yeah, they anticipated this. All of this was somewhat understandable. But nobody has offered them or said to them, here's what is going to happen if and when the regime collapses.
Well, it sounded in the president's statement last night that he expects the Iranian people to do it. There is no roadmap whatsoever. Where do they even go to say, all right, we're going to take over? But to your knowledge, and yours as well, if you're aware, is there a group that exists within Iran that has the strength in numbers, in powers? Because if you think about the repressive nature of this regime, who's been able to, audibly, voiceably rise up and say, we're here, we're stepping in?
The short answer to that is no one. And I say that knowing very well that the Iranian diaspora has rallied around Reza Pahlavi, who is the son of the late Shah. Many of them, the monarchists, have wanted him to emerge as a unifying figure, and he's tried to embark on that role. He's recently been elevated in Western European capitals and here in the United States. But whether or not he has the organizational infrastructure and the reputation to be able to command people on the ground in Iran to say, we are going to keep this country together. We are going to create a quick government, the way that, again, the United States after the 2003 created the Iraqi Governing Council, which was an umbrella of various factions who didn't agree with each other, but because the Americans were there, was able to bring them into a room together. Is there anyone on the ground who's going to be able to do that in Iran? He thinks he can. His supporters think he can. But the reality of it is, in a country of 93 million people with dozens of ethnicities, multiple factions, rivalries among the security forces and the government and the ministries, it is highly unlikely that he's going to be parachuted into downtown Tehran and suddenly command the respect of millions of people to say, hey, this is now our new leader, and he's going to lead us through a transition to democracy.
As we've seen, all of the action, Elise, has been on the United States and the Israeli part in terms of the attacks. To what extent do we expect allies in the region to support this military operation? And what about those in Europe? Where will they stand? Because it has been very tense the last few months between our allies who've stood with us through thick and thin. They certainly stood with us in Iraq. So will they be there for this?
Well,
just to get that far?
Prime Minister Mark Carney has already said that don't expect them to become involved in this. And so within the region, you look at how they are in the war right now, and Ayman is more well-sourced in the region, but how could they not? They're getting bombed. They're getting attacked now. So we have made the Gulf states party to this war. And I think that what Eamon described about just the impossibility of any kind of surgical regime change after what the U.S. experienced attempting to do so in Iraq with all of our full military might, with dedicating, as General Hertling commanded, some of the many troops, hundreds of thousands of troops. So how does that intersect with Trump's political ambitions and popularity here at home, too?
It also doesn't...
General, I know you want to weigh in on this. What are your thoughts, sir?
Yeah, it's a great comment. And what I'd say is, based on what we've seen so far today with Iran attacking Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, they've launched missiles against each one of those states. They are not going to be in a position where they're going to want to help Iran a whole lot. In fact, I would suggest that all of those nations, all of them partners of ours, would see a chaos situation in Iran as being to their advantage. So I'm not sure we're going to see the kind of stepping forward to create any kind or assistance in creating any kind of government capability within Iran itself. And you combine that with the diaspora that Eamon was just talking about, the amount of different factions and cults and tribes and religious groups within Iran. It is going to be much more difficult than what occurred in Iraq. And I got to tell you, I've got a lot of scar tissue from Iraq. It was extremely difficult there. And we had forces on the ground and named people that could take over, as he just mentioned a few minutes ago. I'm not sure that same capability exists within Iran right now.